Welcome to engagementb2b.com. This is our lecture series, which is entitled The Essentials of B2B Value-Based Marketing. In this episode, we're going to answer the question, what is a value proposition? Hi, my name is Jim Naris, and I'll be the presenter today. If you'd like to reach me via email, you can at engagementb2b@gmail.com. All right, now when we look at a value proposition, I think the easiest way to conceptualize this is basically it's a description of your product in terms of what's important to the customer. When most sales and marketing people describe their product, they have a tendency to focus in on the features. And there's a good reason for that, in that if as a manufacturer or a producer, you create features. Well, customers in general are not interested in the features. What they want to know is what's in it for them. So a good value proposition describes your product in terms of what's important to the customer. All right, so let me give you a handy-dandy definition of a value proposition, and it goes as follows. A 2 to 3 sentence statement that tells the prospect what is most worthwhile and memorable about your offering. Now, there's two key words there, worthwhile and memorable. And you might ask, why are these important? Well, a value proposition needs to be brief. And the reason is that in B2B marketing, when the customer decides which product to buy, typically the supplier and his or her salesperson is not there. Therefore, a good sales and marketing team has to arm the purchasing and supply manager with all of the arguments they need to help make the decision in your favor. And the way you do that is to give them a list of things that are most important to them. Now, why 2 or 3 sentences? Why be brief? Why be concise? Because they have to remember it. And they're not going to remember a long laundry list of features or benefits. You have to boil it down to that for them. Now, when I look at what are the contents of a value proposition, it simply comes down to promise and proof. I'm promising value, but then I have to prove that I can deliver it. Now, this turns out to be important because those of us that are in marketing and sales are often accused of making promises that can't be delivered. Well, to be successful with a value proposition, you're going to have to prove that, in fact, you can do this. All right, now let me just illustrate what I said with a diagram. This blue rectangle represents the sum total of the customer's goals and problems. This orange rectangle represents that piece of their goals and problems which can be solved by a product such as yours. They define it in terms of specifications and an acceptable price. All right, this is your offering, which ideally overlaps those specifications. And this is your competitor's offering. Now, a couple of things immediately come to mind. First of all, both products completely overlap the specifications and acceptable price. So both of your products meet the basic requirements that the customer has. The second thing is that there's purple blocks both in your competitor's offering and yours, and we're going to refer to those as non-value adding points of difference. So yeah, they make you different, but in fact the customer doesn't really need them. So these non-value adding points of difference are basically adding cost and hence price to your product. Where do you want to be in terms of a value proposition? Well, up here with this red rectangle, which I've described as differentiated value proposition. Why is this a good value proposition? Because it provides benefits to the customer and they're not offered by the competitor. So in a nutshell, that's what you're searching for with a value proposition. In our research, we find that there are 3 types of value propositions that salespeople and marketers tend to offer. And these are a function of the type of question that the customer asks you. The first is what we refer to as the all benefits value proposition. And here you're answering the question, why should I buy your product? Now, typically when a salesperson gets this question, he or she gives them a long laundry list of everything positive you could conceivably state about the product. Well, the problem with that is no one's going to remember all those points. All right, the second question, which leads to what we're going to refer to as all points of difference value proposition, answers the question, why should I buy your product instead of your competitors? And lastly, there's what we prefer, is what we're going to refer to as the resonating focus value proposition. And that answers the question, what is most worthwhile about your product that I should remember? Now let me graphically illustrate this as well. And I'm going to argue that you can describe these three as being good, better, and best. In the first column to the left, you see all benefits. So basically, someone asks, why should I buy your product? And I give you this list of a lot of things. The problem with this is that there's too many points. There's a classic study done by Hermann Simon, who's the German Nobel Prize winner in economics, where he looked at how many points does the typical person remember in an 80-minute presentation. Well, you might think a lot, but it turns out to be 5 or less. So that begs the question, if someone's only going to remember 5 things, why am I giving them a list of 20 things? All right, so that's the deficiency of all benefits. So I move to the all points of difference value proposition, and you can see one of the distinctions here is that to the left I have bullet points and to the right I have numbers. Now what's the difference here? Well, I always chide students about their reports. You know, some of them use bullets and numbers interchangeably whenever they put together a list, when in fact there's a specific meaning of each one of them. If I list bullet points, I'm basically saying that all of the points I'm listing are more or less equal, therefore it doesn't matter how I present them. If I use numbers such as the following 1 through 8 list, the implication is that the first point is most important, number 2 is the second most important, and so on down the line. So I'm basically adding a prioritization to the list. So I ask students, you know, what's the difference? And more often than not, they can't answer. And I say, all right, you use bullets. Are you certain that all of these points are more or less the same? And of course, they come back and say that they're not. So in the all points of difference, we're basically removing those things that are not important, the points of parity, and we're keying in on the importance points of superiority, starting with the most important and working down the line. Now the last resonating focus, how do we get to resonating focus? Well, there's a great line that I remember from the late Dean Smith, who was the coach of the University of North Carolina Tar Heels basketball team for many, many years. And I can remember him giving a talk many years ago about coaching a team. At the end, he had your standard Q&A session, and I can remember one of the questions. Someone in the audience said, what do you tell the guys at halftime when your team is losing? And Dean Smith, spent a couple of minutes thinking about it, and he said, I try to come up with 2 things to help them improve. Now, I only do 2 things because they're not going to remember any more. It's not like going to your kid's soccer game on the weekend where you have 20 parents yelling 50 things for the kids to do to improve their game. Boil it down to 2 things because that's about the most that they can remember. Now, Dean Smith said I tend to pick out one that's defensive, one that's an offensive thing. More importantly, he said that I try to pick out those guidelines that are in fact feasible. So he said, sometimes I wish I had a 7 foot 1 inch center available, but I don't have that guy on my team. Therefore, I can't make recommendations based on a 7'1" center. So I have to make recommendations that are in fact truly feasible. So 2 things, those things that are feasible, that's a good way to look at resonating focus value propositions. All right, now there's a great book out by 2 former Microsoft employ Zagula and Tong, where they talk about what makes a value proposition persuasive. That is, I want to convince the customer to take action. And they say it comes down to three things. One, you want to focus in on superior points of difference. What is it that makes your product different and superior to the competition? Two, what they call the rule of three, which basically says never give more than three value elements in a value proposition. And again, why would they say that? Because you can't remember more than three. And then lastly, they put forward what they call the rule of paradox. Now, this isn't always possible, but when it is, it works perfectly. A paradox obviously is something that seems counterintuitive. The value of a paradox is that people hear it and they say, how is that possible? How did you do it? The classic example that I remember is from many, many years ago, the original Miller Lite commercials. And if you've seen these on best commercial programs on TV, you basically had two sets of former athletes in a bar argument over why Miller Lite tastes well. And one team says tastes great, and the other team of former athletes says less filling. Now, the reason that that's a paradox is that most people assume that for a beer to taste good, it has to have a lot of calories, and these guys are challenging it. Now, again, why is that successful? Because it's counterintuitive and people want to know how is it that you did it. So, to make your value propositions better, focus in on superior points of difference. Don't give more than three value elements and try to work in a paradox. All right, now here's an example of a concisely written value proposition for a disguised manufacturer of vacuum pumps. And this is used in air conditioning repair. So you can see the technician here has got his vacuum pump hooked up to the air conditioning unit. And basically what he's going to try to do is reduce the atmospheric pressure to zero to, first of all, boil off any impurities in the system, and secondly, to determine if there's any cracks in the pipe. In that if there's cracks in the pipe, then it'll never go down to zero atmospheric pressure. Now, the reason that this is an important step in the process is that it's a bottleneck, in that he has to do this before he can move on to the repair stage. Now, the title of this dry piston vacuum pump has a significant meaning in that, first of all, it's dry, which means that there's no oil associated with it. And with the price of oil, that turns out to be important. This doesn't have it, so obviously that's a significant benefit. When you say dry piston, you mean that this is a compressor reconfigured as a vacuum pump. And what that implies to those that are in the know is that a compressor works more productively and quicker when you get down to zero atmospheric pressure. The bottom line is that a compressor will get the job done faster than a traditional vacuum pump. So the value proposition they came up with was the faster drawdown performance of the Kunst 1600 dry piston vacuum pump enables your firm to complete more jobs in the busy season and earn more while eliminating the oil change mess and hassle. All right, now going back to my definition, I said that a good value proposition has promise and proof. Well, these guys lead with the promise. The promise is the first two lines, the faster drawdown performance of the Kunst 1600 dry piston vacuum pump. And the reason that this is proof is that it's, first of all, dry, which means it doesn't have oil. And secondly, it's a dry piston vacuum pump, which acts more quickly, gets the job done quicker when you get down to zero atmospheric pressure. So faster drawdown time means I get the job done quicker. So that's the proof. What's my promise here? Well, because I get the job done quicker, your firm will be able to complete more jobs in the busy season and earn more while eliminating the oil change mess and hassle. So I get done faster, which means I can do more jobs, which means I make more money. It's a dry piston vacuum pump, which means there's no oil and I don't have to deal with that hassle. So again, this is a good example of a concisely written value proposition that's easy for the customer to remember. If you'd like to read more about value propositions, again, I recommend our two books, Value Merchants and Business Market Management, which you can obtain online from Amazon.com or other fine retail book establishments. If you want to learn more about what Professor Stewart and I are doing in research, and more importantly, what our current research findings are, I encourage you to go to our research website, engagementb2b.com. Okay, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to our discussion today about value propositions. In the next session, I'm going to talk about how you craft value propositions and use them in two types of selling. The first of which is value selling, which is appropriate for strategic products, and tiebreaker selling, which is appropriate for non-strategic products. Thank you.